Hello, everyone. Welcome to EA Zoom meetings. My name is Tara All, and this meeting is You Are Saturn. If any of you have not been part of my You Are the Planets or We Are the Planets series, this is a continuation. And We Are the Planets started, well, a number of years ago for me, maybe 5 years now. I lose track. But I started using the technique Planets on the First, which is not a new technique. I just think we don't play with it as much these days. It's where you actually rotate, you pick a planet that you want to make the focal point of your experience or a filter through which you live life, which is great if you want to bring out more of something, like more of your Mars, more of your Saturn, more of your Jupiter, whatever that thing may be. But you rotate the zodiac so that planet is on the ascendant. And then you basically consciously choose in your day-to-day life to live that planet first. For me, this was born out of my need to have a more experiential journey with astrology. And I was working a lot with my teacher, Adam Gainsbourg, at the time. And he said, hey, check out this technique, try this and see how it works for you. And it does, and I'm still doing it. So for me, every year on my birthday, in July, I choose a new planet to live first. And then I spend that whole year with that focus or intention and gather my reflections. And that helps me learn more about the archetypes in a very personal way. And I've had a lot of success with this with clients in general. And so with EA Zoom meetings, I'm going through basically a meeting with each of the planets where we're playing around with it and how we can live that planet more. And we have reached Saturn. I have to tell you, I was laughing because I realized that next is probably, well, I typically pronounce it Uranus, but the next meeting is going to be You Are Uranus. So that is going to be an interesting thing to play around with. I had not thought about that when I first went into the series, but for now we're going to stick with Saturn. I want to mention that as we talk about Saturn today, that this particular year that I'm in, I'm living Venus first for the second time. And so everything that I have been observing and everything we'll talk about with Saturn is coming through somewhat of a Venusian filter for me. So I just throw that out there for you to know that that's my space in the world right now, which is interesting because it's a very different flavor working with Saturn when you're coming from Venus first. And yeah, so we'll talk more about that, but just hold that loosely as we go. So these slides, if they're a little bit weird or disorganized, please just bear with me. I don't know, I'm these days I'm less of a fan of slides because I like just personal interaction, but I feel like having something is good as well. So I'm still trying to find that balance within myself of just spontaneous sharing and coming up with things in advance. So there's going to be a combination of both today. And then we have Cassia, Cameron, and Susie all here who are going to give their own, sharing of experiences with Saturn. And all four of us have Saturn in a different sign, which is super awesome. So we'll get to really see some different ways that Saturn manifests and some different ideas for how to work with Saturn. Because I know for me, it's so useful to hear someone else's perspective because it's just impossible when you're in your own self sometimes to get that different vantage point. But in general, Saturn to me has a feeling of do it, make it, own it, and when Saturn comes around by transit or progression, or if it's super strong in your natal chart, there's a need to solidify something. The Saturn that is in each of us, right? The whole idea of planets first is that the planets, as above, so below, the planets are inside of us. Each of the planets represents a different part of our psyche. So the Saturn in us doesn't just want to come up with the idea or the feeling of something. It's about actually doing something with what we have. And that sets it aside from some other planets or parts of ourselves for sure. And when we're experiencing Saturn transits or progressions, especially the famous Saturn return in opposition, we come face to face with the reality we've manifested. Those of you listening that aren't watching the slides, I have reality in quotes because I don't mean reality to be what is true. I mean reality to be what we have constructed and made and what we see and think is real in our worlds. And that is so much to me what Saturn is. And it's so interesting as I've been now practicing for about 10 years and I have changed so much through my practice of astrology. It really is why I do astrology. I do like to teach and share and I like working with clients and all that stuff, but my motivation with astrology is personal. It's because it helps me to grow. It really does help me to uncover new parts of myself and to really expand my level of consciousness, which for me with the North Node in Sagittarius is very important. And Saturn to me is one of those areas that really lets us break into new territory. And I think I have some slides later, but I'll just throw it out here now. The thing about Saturn is it gets relegated to a lot of mundane things we talk about oftentimes with Saturn, but we do live in part a mundane world. You know, we are doing all those things, and Saturn is really just reflecting the part of us that does those things. And that is a different relationship with Saturn than simply looking at Saturn as doing something to us or asking us to do something. It's really reflecting what's already in us. So when we work with Saturn, we come face to face with what we've made, literally what we've made, you know, and what we're doing with our lives and how we spend our time and how we take care of ourselves and how we ended up where we are in this moment. So some of us were having a little chat before the meeting just about personal experiences lately. And I was sharing that for the past 2.5 months, I've just been sick. I've had one virus after another. Then I got a urinary tract infection and my IBS has been all crazy. So there's all these things going on. And I don't say this because I'm in some need of, you know, I don't need some chat about how I can fix it. I'm sharing it because it's reflecting something going inside of me, and it has something to do with Saturn to me. I have Saturn and Cancer in the 4th house. And so I'm not having an exact transit right now with that area, but I have a lot of stuff in the 4th house. So all those big players up there in Capricorn playing around, you know, they're all in some sense opposing that Cancer 4th house stuff that I have in there. And for me, part of these lessons are Saturn and Cancer in the 4th house is being real serious about taking care of yourself. You know, we think about Saturn being serious about working hard, but working hard isn't always going out and doing that work in the external world. Sometimes it's about doing what's necessary to take care of you. Sometimes for me, I have to get pushed to a pretty difficult place before I actually figure out what is best to strengthen and take care of me. And that to me is part of the Saturn experience. So that's kind of where I'm sitting right now. So as I'm sharing right now about reality, that's my reality right now. So in every moment I'm sitting having those things or those symptoms or those experiences, it's up to me whether or not I want to own them, you know, and find maybe a better, healthier way to do me or not. You know, the option is there for me. But the cool thing about Saturn and what we call reality or manifestation is we actually get to see what we're making. You know, the choices and the things we do in our lives actually allow us to see what's working or what's not working. It's not just an idea or something we think about. We really know, you know, and that to me is something very valuable to work with. So during these periods, when Saturn is, you know, coming around, knocking on the door in any way. And by the way, just because you're not having a Saturn transit or a Saturn progression or Saturn super strong in your chart doesn't mean you won't have moments where you need to work with Saturn. You know, let's not limit ourselves with just what happens in the astrology chart. I know we're talking about that today, but it can show up at all periods and times. But in that time, it can feel like a test, you know, and it can trigger our fears. And to me, we're actually challenging ourselves to stabilize, right? There's a need to stabilize when Saturn comes around. Something needs stabilization. And how do we stabilize with Saturn? Oftentimes that's through effort and determination, but that effort and determination doesn't have to be physical labor, for example. And I think sometimes we get those things mixed up. We think that with Saturn, if we work harder in a traditional sense, meaning, you know, work harder clocking hours at the job or work harder, you know, cleaning up the house or whatever, that's going to be the answer. Sometimes it is. Sometimes the harder work is a different kind of work. Sometimes for some of us, it's harder to be quiet. You know, it's harder to step back. That's just as hard work. So when Saturn comes around, it means we're ready to take charge and change our reality. This is where I'm saying, I think Saturn's less about the reality we're stuck in and more about the reality we want to create, which requires change. Alrighty. So what's the purpose of our Saturn selves? Well, we have to look at the chart because it's personal. Saturn's not going to be the same for everyone. And every chart is going to show up different. Every person's going to show up different. And the different periods in your life is going to show up different. But the sign will tell you its motives. And so that's a good place to start. The function of Saturn is the same for all of us, but the how and the why is not. And that's why it's so important to look at things. right? You know, Saturn in Cancer in the fourth house, for example, is going to be a super different experience than Saturn in Capricorn in the first house, right? It's just a completely different experience, right, Cameron? We know that that's a very different experience. But they still want the same. It's like the function, what it's trying to do, the strengthening doesn't change, but how and what that looks like changes. So what is the function of Saturn? And this is something that I would like everyone, not just the volunteers, if you have a good definition of what the function of Saturn is, I would love to hear it. Because of all the planets, I feel like Saturn has been shoved in a little corner that I don't think is truly fully Saturn. So I like to play around with that and say, well, how else can we recreate in our minds the function of Saturn? We usually agree on its agenda, meaning our own agenda, to strengthen, to mature, to accomplish, to be responsible, to have discipline, to gain mastery, to face limitations, and to earn respect. And here's the thing. If you're working in any of those areas, of course you're going to deal with restrictions and limits. That's the nature of those things. So it's not so much that Saturn is restrictions and limits, that just comes in the territory. And I think it's important to remember that. It's not about the restrictions and limits. That's just part of the tools or part of the experiences that, you know, leads us down the Saturn path. So a little bit about restrictions and limits. Most of our restrictions and limits are self-created and imposed. I'm not saying every single one, but most of them it is. We make that happen for ourselves. And we're really good at it. And we're really good at complaining about it while we keep doing it because it makes us feel safe and secure because it's what we know. That's just kind of what human beings do a lot of the time. None of us are special because we do it. It's just kind of a thing. But our Saturn selves are actually a little wiser than that. Our Saturn selves know we can't move past that until we actually meet those things eye to eye. We have to see them for what they are. We have to come face to face with our quote unquote reality. So Saturn absolutely wants us to see reality, but that reality is what we've made up individually and collectively, right? I mean, both of these apply. Saturn, and I did a little research because, you know, I like working with lots of areas of metaphysics, not just astrology. And one of those is the chakra system. And if you do some research on Saturn, you'll find that there's a good number of people that associate Saturn with the root chakra. Okay, security, safety, earthiness, that makes sense, groundedness, right? But equally, it corresponds with the third eye chakra. I personally prefer the third eye with Saturn. I actually think Mars has a more root connection. And I like third eye for Saturn because the third eye is all about vision. It's all about opening yourself up to life as it really is, not just what you make of it. And I think that's where Saturn leads us. Saturn, in some respects, even, you know, maybe it helps us create in some ways, we create a limitation so we can recognize a limitation, so we can move past the limitation. There's a lot of ways you can play around with this. But it feels more true for me than some of the other ways that at least I've explored Saturn. Even in the past with myself, like I'm coming to have a new relationship with Saturn. So what about Saturn in the solar system? Because of all the planets, or at least most of them, like Saturn in the solar system doesn't really match what we say about Saturn. So we say it's the boundary, but now we know in the right conditions, we can see Uranus with the naked eye. And that, to me, reflects that we're in a different place in our, I guess, evolution of recognizing what's inside of ourselves. But Saturn's no longer the naked eye boundary, which means we have to make room for a different understanding of Saturn. And possibly Uranus as well, if that's the case. And it's really easy for us to say and to feel in times of Saturn, you know, boy, do I ever know it, that energy sometimes makes us feel small and constricted. But it's the second largest planet in the solar system. It's not small at all. And it's completely gassy. Do you know, we have this heaviness that we oftentimes associate with it, even like something's holding us down. You know, we just kind of can't get ourselves going. It feels like no matter what we do, we just hit the brick wall. You know, some of these things can happen with Saturn, but it's the least dense planet of all. So I don't attempt to answer all these things today, but I think it's worth exploring when you're working with Saturn, especially if you choose to live Saturn first, to remember those things about Saturn. And this is pretty cool. Saturn has more moons than any planet. Now, of course, based on what we know, because there could be a million other things that we haven't discovered yet. But based on what we know, it now has the most moons. We discovered 20 new moons for Saturn this year in 2019. So now it totals 82, 3 more than Jupiter, at least last when I checked. It has the most moons, which is interesting to me. 82 moons. And I thought about, like, think about Saturn, like, and this is rather stereotypical, so just bear with me here, but think about Saturn, you know, being the leader of an organization, right? Being the empire of something. And think about all the people that fall into place, you know, around that structure of Saturn, if you will. The moons in some ways even reflect that. It's like a giant committee. I mean, we've got all of these moons that are orbiting Saturn. So on some level, that to me does reflect the leadership that we oftentimes see with Saturn. I mean, I don't know how it is that certain, you know, objects in space end up orbiting around a planet, but I do think it's interesting that for whatever reason, at this point in time, we now know that it has more than Jupiter. Okay, so for me, and I'm just going to get just a couple brief sharings with myself, as I don't want to spend too much time with my monologue because I'm excited for our interaction. Last year, I chose to live Saturn and Moon first together. It was the first time I did a joint pairing of planets at the same time. And I did it because my partner suggested that after a few years of doing this, that maybe I try doing something that offers a little bit more of a balance. And so I picked Saturn and Moon, being that there's somewhat a natural polarity, at least with the signs that they rule with Cancer and Capricorn. So I kind of wanted to see what would show up if I chose them both at the same time. And this image here, by the way, on the screen is my little Saturnscape. And it's sort of my version of, like, you know, all those moons or all the rings that, you know, go around Saturn. For me, I think with ourselves, we have all those parts of us, you know, that are orbiting around, that are part of that reality system. Saturn really, in some respects, is a big committee within ourselves, right? So I'm just going to read this. This is way too long of a slide just for you to look at for yourself. I just want you to get a feel for what came to me. This is part on my website. If you're interested, on my website, I do have a section for planets first. And at the end of each year, I share my reflections, which includes my personal writing and personal experiences and just really what I gained from that time. And this is just a very short excerpt from that. With Moon and Saturn on my mind, I was thinking about being born, conditioning, and self-defining. Saturn and Moon can describe our culture, genetics, and upbringing, part of the material we come from, but they're just ingredients in the mix. No ingredient stands alone or commands the thing created from its contribution. Once it is contributed and alchemized with all the other ingredients, it no longer retains its own integrity. It no longer is anything except the creation it became. And so parents give their children the gift of living, but not as wholly and completely as they like to believe. On some level, every creature created has brought itself into being, not on its own, of course, but of its own will. And children were meant to surpass their parents, to go further, think bigger, and bring forth new worlds. Sometimes to do so, they need to leave their parents behind. For me, my Moon-Saturn year was a huge time of internal growing up. And the Saturn part of that time, it was less demanding in the sense of, like, it didn't feel rigid as far as get out there and work harder. Although part of that's my nature anyway. I found myself actually letting go of commitments and reprioritizing what I was doing during that year, because I recognized that in some respects, I wasn't choosing the things that had the most value. And some of the things I was doing were running me ragged. So Saturn, strangely, because I just hadn't anticipated this, was almost like my biggest protector. It wasn't always easy, but Saturn was the ultimate, like, doing too much, girl, you know, and like something would happen and it would be, I mean, and I would know it. And Saturn, you know, hits you where it counts. Like, again, like it's going to be in your real life, in your real day. Okay. And then my last part, this is my, so my natal Saturn, as I was sharing, is in Cancer in the 4th house. And this is, I feel like this really summed it up for me. And what I would love not that Cassie, Cameron, and Susie, not that I would expect you to come up with something like on the fly for when it's your turn. But when I read this part with my Saturn and Cancer in the fourth house, I would love it if you would kind of be filling in with yourself if there was something short you could share about where your Saturn's placed for you, because I feel like that makes it come alive. So here's where I ended up at that time. I'm big, but still small. It suits me well. This child's costume that's ripping at the seams with sleeves up to my elbows. I like feeling myself grow out of things. In these days of 40-something, my 5-year-old still throws her parties and they're multiplied by 9. I say I'm growing up, but I'm really growing in. And for me, the Saturn Cancer fourth house experience has been absolutely that. An internal growth. You know, taking responsibility for my own emotional needs, taking responsibility, honestly, for everything. All right. The devil. Let's just talk about the devil for a second, because it is Saturn and Saturn gets relegated as the devil many times. And in the tarot, the devil card corresponds with Capricorn, which of course we know is an associated archetype with Saturn. And in the tarot, the devil card is about mastery of life force in the material world. One thing I think that gets lost with Saturn and with Capricorn is the idea of mastery of life force. It's the material world is part of it, but partly we're just dealing with the life force and the power we have to create things. And the devil, in this context, is the master of applying the laws of nature. And those don't have morals. And this is really important to emphasize here. Saturn, in the way that I'm relating it to the devil here with the tarot, there's nothing moral about it. Nature just is nature. The only reason why the devil in the tarot works with morals is because we humans create them. Saturn works with what we make. Saturn is reflecting us working with what we make. It's not that it was the morals, it's that we create those things and now we work with them. So the devil works with every energy manifestation, the full axis of each one, and the polarity, and so both ends, polarities and everything in between. There's nothing left out of that. And all the negative Saturn aspects are simply the blocks that we need to see about ourselves to progress. If you want to think about Saturn out there in the solar system, think about all the rings of protection, right? In some ways, we need to break through them. And the devil in the tarot embodies our shadow, which of course is everything most of the time that we don't want to see and we don't want to own it. It's what bedevils us. And it's the illusions that we blind and bind ourselves with. And in almost every single depiction of the devil in the tarot, you will see the lovers and they will be bound, but their chains or their ropes will never be all the way locked, which means at any point in time, they could pull them apart and they would be free. And that's the thing with this energy. It's not really binding. In fact, it's full of fertility and energy. It's so potent with the ability to, work within it, because it hits us kind of right in the crucible of right where we're knotting ourselves up, and getting ourselves all worked up or whatever it may be, setting our own limitations. And right in that space, there's so much energy. So this is the idea here where it's pure raw power and life force. And any manifestation of that much power is going to have an extreme shadow. There's no way it can't. Extreme light has extreme shadow. And so that's really just what we're working with here. And I like the idea of always saying that the key about the devil card is to awaken to the responsibility of our entire selves. And responsibility is a really good Saturn word. And to realize that I'm the devil who made me do it. The devil, when you're working with the tarot, it's the hardest one to interpret because it's so personal. Every single person has their own version of that. Okay. Before we jump into charts, the only piece I want to add is a tiny bit about each sign and about potential contribution to the world, because Saturn very much as a function in us that wants to contribute. How that happens and how we're best suited to do it can, varies, but Saturn wants that. Saturn wants to earn that respect, and Saturn has the gift of bringing forward into the world wisdom that comes from experience. And in my opinion, this is just me, people that speak wisdom and truth from their experience, there is nothing more powerful than that. And I'm a big fan of books and knowledge and looking things up, and I do it all the time, but nothing for me hits home like someone who has been through something and something difficult, and they have kept at it and gone through it, and they have developed skills and techniques, whatever they've needed to do to move through that piece. Then they master that part of themselves on some level. That, to me, well, I suppose that's what I aspire to do, and so sometimes that's why oftentimes I will share with you guys how I end up choosing less or doing less. And that's because sometimes that's the best that I can do. I have tried to make it a practice of mine to not go beyond what I can live at least a good portion of the time. And Saturn is part, to me, helps me come to that place of here's what I really am available for. And then to do what I really can within that space, and that's commendable to me. And that's inspirational to me, just as inspirational as anything that, Jupiter or Sagittarius may do. They just, look a little different. So to me, the person who has sat with his or her fears in the most uncomfortable places, felt his or her own judgment and feelings of weakness, failure, and frustration, taken accountability for him, herself, and what he or she is really available for, stayed through it all, and actually does what he or she can to get stronger and accomplish his or her great work. I Stole Great Work from Stephen Forrest. He talks about Capricorn and of course, with its relationship with Saturn as always being on some level about our great work. And our great work does not have to be, writing a book or owning a company. Our great work might be overcoming an inner pattern, right? Or even like an inner thought paradigm that holds us back. It could be being the best parent. It could be growing the best garden. But on some level, Saturn leads us to that place of great work. And that great work, and Linda and I, this has come up before, leads us partly to our satisfaction. And that's different for all of us. But Saturn truly leads to that satisfaction. So someone who has gone through all this, that's the person who's earned their own respect. And when you earn your own respect, that is really when you earn the respect of others. I think they only go hand in hand. And to me, it's a very Saturn experience. And that does come from getting real, getting down to what is. It's great. We can have all kinds of conversations about what we think we could be doing or wish we could be doing, or even we can look at our chart and say, oh, I have all these gifts and talents and but that's great. But if you're not really working with it, not really doing it, it's still in the realm of just possibility, which is exciting and fun and it can help us. But ultimately, I like to see, where the tires meet the tracks, So we know most of this already. I just put a few key words for each sign, Saturn in each sign as far as potential contribution to the world. There's a million different ways to do it. But keeping in mind that with like the slide before, what I talked about, Aries, for example, leader, pioneer, courageous action, initiation, strength of spirit, get up and go. This contribution to the world oftentimes comes through someone who's had to struggle with these things. They may have had to sit with their own fears of standing up for themselves or taking the lead or making the first move. It generally with Saturn, things generally don't come quote unquote easy. And that's partly because the satisfaction of Saturn comes from things that we know we had to put in the time and effort to reach. It's like, when you look back on these things with your own life, and there are certain times where you can say, wow, I really stuck in there for this thing. Maybe it's a relationship with someone in your family or a friend, and you think, wow, for the last 25 years, I have stuck in there and done that through the thick and thin. And there's a way that we are just deeply proud and feel good about ourselves for having done that. It's tried and true over time, and that's part of the Saturn thing. And with Taurus, with beauty, comfort, knowing what has value, right? This is such a key part of Taurus. Capricorn will work hard. Capricorn will go after it, whatever it is, but it's Taurus that inherently knows what has the value. So without that instinctual knowing of what is worth working hard for, we can spend our energy on things that are not really what we really wanted to do in the first place. Or we reach the point of fruition, right? Oh, I've achieved the goal, or I've done the thing, and to realize that it feels empty, right? The Taurus energy is partly what helps us know what is going to make us feel full. which is interesting because, we link food with Taurus too, but there is the thing about what will really make us feel full, what will truly satiate us. And steady and determined progress, of course, also for Taurus. Gemini, knowledge, communication, wit, flexibility, ability to see both sides. And of course, there's the idea with a quick mind. But it doesn't always come easy. Again, some people with Saturn in Gemini have had to deal with learning struggles. Sometimes it's hard for people because Saturn can also, cause that to be the case. But generally it's because if you work through that, there's a whole lot of gold at the end. So I'm not saying these and just saying, oh, they on day one to show up as potential contribution. They come through the evolutionary process, but in the end, these are the things where you will oftentimes be known for that. When you put in that time and effort and you reach a certain point and people look back and say, wow, that Jimmy, he's a real master when it comes to blah, blah, blah. Or, that Rachel, she is really wise when it comes to, and that's total Saturn talk. The wise elder that people want to be around, that's Saturn. Cancer, it can be nurturing, emotional intelligence, understanding, creating home and belonging, and empathy and healing. With Leo, creativity, passion, generosity. I always feel with Leo, shining the light, not just on themselves, but on others. Just the ability to do that is very powerful. It can change someone's entire life. You shine the light on someone just in one moment, and sometimes that's all it takes, like to light them, turn them back on. Playfulness and vulnerable self-expression. Virgo, efficiency, improvement, critical thinking, and lineage. Virgo oftentimes is the part of us that links back to the traditions of the past, and it passes that along. Think about apprenticeship, for example, with Virgo. Tools, techniques, devotion. Libra, we have diplomacy, mediation, charm, style, harmony, symmetry, partnership, cooperation, beauty. I'm not trying to draw these into, for example, you can definitely see that art could fit there. My intention is not to bundle everything up. It's just to remind us of key words because, it's kind of good to always go back to the basics, at least a little bit. Saturn in Scorpio can be through transformation, regeneration, empowerment, intimacy, psychology, confrontation, right? Think about Saturn in Scorpio and its ability to penetrate through the surface of things and to get underneath to the truth of what is really there, to the real motivation. And Sagittarius, greater truth, forward motion, knowledge from direct experience. I always think of Sagittarius as being the one that climbs the mountain and Capricorn being the one that takes all that stuff from the top of the mountain and takes it back down and makes it useful. So that's kind of the challenge between those two archetypes, moving from Sag to Capricorn. But the knowledge from experience is something that Sag brings to the table. Having gone on the adventure, having done the exploration, having tried the different thing, now has then a direct experience to share about it, which is different than reading it in a book. It's different when you actually have it happen to you. Optimism, inspiration, confidence, and of course, intuition. Capricorn, leadership, similar to Aries, duty and great works, responsibility, achieving goals, the wise elder, and the orchestration of available resources. I have never, I spent a lot of years in healthcare and the business side of things, and I have never seen anyone better than Capricorn at orchestrating what is available to them. Like they can just sit and look at a whole organization and reweave it together and find the right person in the right position, move the right thing to the right place. It's really quite a gift, that level of vision. Aquarius, and we have activism, technology, change, societal advancement, innovation, objectivity, authenticity. And then finally to Pisces, we have vision, mysticism, imagination, compassion, faith, acceptance, creativity, and that creativity specifically in the flow of spirit. I think of inspired works so many times coming through the Pisces individuals. Think about, music and the arts, but in many other ways as well, many kinds of visionaries. But I partly bring up these words because now, because we're going to jump into volunteers, into charts. And I bring this up because when we talk about the function of Saturn, it's so different putting it with Pisces, for example, like putting Saturn with compassion versus putting Saturn with Capricorn responsibility, right? There's just a really different flavor. And so keeping that in mind, I want to jump in. Cassia is going to go first, and we're going to jump in here. And I welcome comments at any time. And if anyone has anything now, please, just speak up even before Cassia gets going. That's totally great. I'm excited to hear what you guys think.
Okay. Everybody can hear me. It's fine. The voice.
Yes. And Cassia, let's tell everybody, because I did not do this. You have Saturn in Scorpio conjunct the South Node.
Exactly. On the IC, almost there. So it's very personal.
Yes.
And it's in like very tight sextile with my Moon, Sun, and Jupiter. Actually, Moon and Jupiter, they are like pretty emphasized by this contact. And of course, all are in Capricorn. So it's like a double for me signature that I'm very conscious about this.
Yeah. And before you jump in, so let's just say, certainly the polarity, right, that your North Node is in Taurus, which is ruled by a Venus in Pisces in the 7th house. And I say that just so we can hold this in context, because of course, part of evolutionary astrology is how we're alchemizing it all together, and there's definitely quite a difference between your South Node and your North Node energy. So what would you first, just based on kind of your feel? I kind of gave my feel for what my Saturn and Cancer in the 4th house kind of feels like for me. What would you say yours in Scorpio in the 4th feels like for you?
Well, endurance. Knowledge, to know actually, and to penetrate with this knowledge others departments of life, kind of, I think. And time. I'm very, very concerned with time. I want to be much more organized as I can be. In relation to time. It's very funny sometimes, because really each minute it's very valuable to me. Though my life, generally daily life, it's not very busy actually, because I don't have like work from 8 to 4 to 4, but still I'm very focused on this. I don't want, the worst that can happen to me is to waste my time, actually.
That's the worst thing?
Yeah, well, regarding to Saturn, of course, it's much more worse things, but it's very emotional to me. I can become very emotional about that. And I'm feeling that I'm losing my time, for example. Sometimes if I'm doing, or for example, yes, that's a good example. In my high school, in high school, there is a lot of subject that you are not interested at all in, right? So to sit in my high school, when I was sitting and listening about stuff that I'm not into, that was very important to me, because I felt time passing. And like that it was that's why I didn't want to say that I quit school, but I have very problem with that. Yes, because I just could not stand those moments when I have to waste my time, especially knowing that I can learn something much more useful. It was always binded with the knowledge, actually, to know, to learn something new. For example, also in my primary school, I always been problematic because I always wanted to know more and to learn more. And I had these problems that I was not able to learn the basics, because the basics, come on, basics. I don't care about the basics. I want
Interesting.
more.
Interesting. How's your North Node in Taurus going?
Well, I'm working on it.
I hope you're not working too hard, because that would defeat the purpose of it.
Yeah, but when you ask me about the Saturn and how I could relate to this, to
Yeah.
Saturn, that's what comes to my mind. You know, that now of course, I went through a big transformation. Actually, I'm on the move, right? All the time, especially now. Soon, my Saturn will come to my stellium with Sun, Moon, and Jupiter.
Yeah.
So, yeah, but still, I can feel it now all the time that I'm very like mm, I'm gaining like more structure in my life, but like more relaxed. Like, okay, you don't have to know everything, and you don't have to like be prepared to know, because the feeling that I always used to have is that I need to know as much as I can. I need to be prepared for everything it might come, kind of. Not to be caught that I don't know, right? So,
Yeah, which is a perfect, to me. um I mean, Scorpio already has a tendency, right, to need to know everything. But when you double down with that South Node conjunct Saturn with it at the IC, I mean, that's taken it a step further. It's like it's like a personal. I suspect it probably was your safety. You know, that becomes your security. So
yes, yes, yes. My childhood was not the best.
mm,
Actually, the people that hear about my childhood says that it was very traumatic, but actually not to me.
mhm,
So, well, it's not that my father, he died when I was 1 year old, so I have no like
mhm,
recognition about him. And my mother, she married again when I was, I think, 7 or 6, somewhere that. And I really didn't want her to marry this guy, because this guy, I didn't like him at all. But what I liked what I didn't like the more, like what I hated actually, my mother was weak.
mm,
She was so weak, and I was there to kind of protect her and to carry about her, kind of.
mhm,
So, well, my mom married, and the guy, of course, well, he became an alcoholic, and of course, you can imagine what it's
mhm,
brought with. But still, I remember that I've never cried.
mhm,
I just wanted to pass. Like, I created my own world of knowledge, haha.
mhm,
For example, learning new languages.
mhm,
When I was 9, 10 years, I was learning myself French, and I was writing like pen
mhm,
letters, pen with the
mhm, mhm,
pen
mhm,
people. I
mhm,
don't remember
mhm,
the English name.
mhm.
Um, I learned French, Italian, like myself, to occupy my mind, and I think I survived because of this. And also, I think I was very strong,
Yeah.
because I think this endurance that I have is something that I can be thankful to Saturn.
Yeah.
And because I heard stories about people who with from traumatic houses, like pathological houses or
Mhm.
families, and of course there are tragic stories. And somehow I can relate to them, but I cannot relate to me as this being so traumatic, kind of. It was hard, of course, okay,
Yeah.
but life goes on, and
Yeah. And I think the one thing that is, at least from the chart perspective with that, it's not to minimize any of it, but a South Node in Scorpio conjunct Saturn in Scorpio, it's programmed to receive trauma and drama of life. You know,
mm,
I'm not saying I can understand when you're saying to me it didn't feel that traumatic. It was probably felt more normal. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but
yeah,
there is that element, like because from your chart structure, we can see like that actually North Node and Taurus, like that's actually probably more, if everything was super simple, you know, and you had no problems to worry about and there was nothing to endure and you were just going to like kick back through life, that actually might be more stressful to you.
Yeah, I think,
you know?
so.
Yeah. So I mean, so that this is the thing about like all these things, like it's so personal, right? I mean, it's like if you're used to having problems all the time, it's actually quite terrifying when you have none. You know, what will you do with yourself? So
Yeah.
so I totally get that. What advice? Because I feel like, but you're right about the endurance piece. I mean, Lisa, I'm feeling when you say that, I feel like that is definitely something that wherever Saturn is, you know, it does show that we have that ability. Another thing I just wanted to mention is Saturn is, it's not so. Boundaries is important with Saturn too. You know, Saturn shows us where we need to have boundaries, not because we need to shut ourselves off, but because it helps us be more efficient with our energy and helps us protect ourselves. So that piece is as well. So I think part of your self-protection mechanism was some compartmentalization, you know, which is normal. So when you're going through things like that, it's very normal that you would, like you talked about, like going into your intellectual world, right? Or going into your other space of knowledge or whatnot. That's part of like, you know, that part of you knows, when it's too much, you know. That's one thing Saturn also can help us with. But what would you say as far as, because we are talking about you are Saturn, so if people want to bring out more Saturn, let's just say their chart is not like yours, they do not come from a lot of Saturn, or maybe Saturn is something they're trying to integrate in a new way, what are some things that you would say encouraging wise to someone who is going to try to live Saturn first every day? Maybe.
Well, I can, the biggest gift I think that Saturn is giving me every day is patience also. I started to paint many years ago, and I always, Saturn, of course, the inner critic was telling me, yes, you have to do more, and no, this is bullshit, no, this is bullshit, no, this is bullshit, no, this is bullshit, more and more and more and more. But actually, I was doing a lot of work because I thought, no, this is all bullshit. And people saying my painting were, but what are you telling? You know, because my paintings are very like photographic, like almost almost photographs. So it's sometimes it's hard to distinguish. But that was my point, to be hard to distinguish. But always I always had to find some details that no, this detail of 1 millimeter to 1 millimeter is precise. So since Saturn came into my 5th house like 1 year ago, and then I really I even dedicated one painting to Saturn, actually. Yeah, because Saturn brought me so much patience. Actually, I became so patient. Painting became like meditation. Before I wanted to make it very fast, like hurry, because of time, right? Time is precious because of the time. So, but now, since 1 year, I can spend like 4 hours on one really tiny spot, just focusing on it, and doing it really slowly, like really, really slowly. And this I've never experienced actually with my time problem, time issues, that everything has to be, fast and go smoothly, but fast. So the patience is I think what can one really, really get from Saturn, because what happened to me, I never thought it could be this way. My boyfriend, he says that probably I will go the opposite now. I will just start to paint, I don't know, the pen, And then for the next 10 months, just to make it slowly and very, very like, yes, that's what I experienced. And I really, I'm living with this Saturn discipline, because this is a kind of discipline too, every day. And actually my time issues, problems are less and less apparent. So I can be easily relaxed by not knowing everything, actually. Yeah, and be detached, because before all what was going on in the world, for example, the mediocrity,
Mm.
the people in power that represent mediocrity, I could not stand it emotionally.
Mm.
Because for me, power means knowledge. But now I can easily detach from it. Like, I can find my world again, my discipline and my patience. So yes, I encourage everybody to try this, to see this from this angle, that
Mm.
there's a lot of work one can gain, really, a lot of abilities one can gain from slowing down. Really.
Yeah. And in case you all didn't catch it, Cassie just really did a beautiful job of describing how Saturn is supporting her North Node and that ruler Venus and Pisces in the seventh house. It's even through the art she's doing. So, I mean, truly, I mean, that's a perfect example of how you want to integrate, right? It's not about leaving one for the other, but it's more, wow, if Saturn has served me really well with XYZ, you get the flavor of that, but then you adapt it to the thing that you're moving towards, and it becomes, your greatest strength. So this focus, this detail, this slowing down, this.
Yes, it was something really
It's awesome.
uncommon.
It's awesome. And you may come to find that it's more natural to you than the other
Yeah.
way,
Yes, actually, it's funny, but yes, really. But also the way how I live like in the wild nature, like surrounded by the woods. And
that's nice.
so actually my life 7 years ago, when I moved to this place, really changed. Like, get quiet, get slow, like really get slower and slower and slower and slower. So
That's good, because that Scorpio stuff, it's just too complicated. If you're, it's like,
tell me.
truly, yeah. Oh, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you for doing this.
No, yeah, it's my pleasure. We'll see what Cameron has to say. And again, everybody, please feel free if you have something to add, you can just pop in. Cameron.
Hey, what's up?
Well,
Great presentation.
Well, huh?
Great presentation.
Yeah. Well, we have time because it's Sunday. That's the nice thing about Sunday. So
Yeah.
Linda lets us be flexible. I like doing these Sunday. I've decided it's like a little more relaxed.
Yeah, I like it. Yeah,
But
so I was literally going to say the same thing as her. I was going to say patience.
Whoa, good.
Yeah, that was really cool, and I really appreciate that she said that, because that's what I'm always teaching, especially if Saturn and Capricorn are like representing, social norms and structure of reality and stuff like that. A lot of times we are moving fast, so patience is really important. Also, Saturn represents longevity from my perspective,
Yeah.
So, and it's because it's cold and dry, it's taking its time. We got to have patience with that.
Mm-hmm.
And if we don't, then we get cold and dry. That's like the thing about it. Like, people think that Saturn is like making us cold and dry, but we're running ourselves cold and dry, is what's really actually occurring. And Saturn is just like ruthlessly compassionate and it's just like, here you go.
That is a nice way. I like that. Ruthlessly compassionate. It's true. And Saturn, that part of us, like it sticks with us. Like even when we're like literally working against ourselves, right? Like, and it keeps on trying. It will keep on doing whatever it takes. I think it's so when we recognize that that's us, just like you were saying, that dry cold, however, when you recognize that's you, it's the whole relationship with Saturn changes. But hey, I want to get from you, what would you say? So your first house, like, it's like, clearly you had an intention. I know we have this conversation every time about your chart, but I would love to hear just if you can with the Saturn in Capricorn, like how is that, what does it feel like to you? What is that version of Saturn? Because you live it, I don't live it. So.
Yeah, it shifts really, really fast. Just the nature of it being in the first house and stuff like that. So it's like moment to moment, but it began about authority, or like what is structure? Yeah, so it's always about structure, but before it was about like family, social norms and stuff like that, and like what is the structure of that? And since it's in the first house, I got to move through that really rapidly in my life, I feel like, because I'm literally at my Saturn return, like in this moment. So, but now it's like, it's in a broader perspective, it's like actually the structure of reality and like how I'm experiencing it directly, how things come together. Even just thinking about the body and in the structure of it in the first house as well is what I'm saying about the body. I'm learning to master the body, and it was through like injuries in football that has actually led me to like learning how to master the human anatomy in the way that I have been, even understanding it in just ways that like, it's just different. That's the way I'm resonating with it currently. Also, people coming to me as like a father figure type of person, or even sometimes judgment is a big thing with Saturn too, because I could talk to somebody and ask them a question and they think that I'm judging them. So I realize now the reflection of Saturn isn't necessarily that Saturn is judgment, but we feel so restricted and limited within ourselves that we project out that people are judging us.
Oh yeah.
So like a lot of times I experience what the collective thinks Saturn is, and I'm just observing it. Yeah, and I'm like being patient about it and reflecting on it. And that's another big Saturn word for me, reflection. Because if we're going to master something, then it's necessary that we reflect on it.
Yeah, and when you say Cameron, like I know, like for me, like when I was opening up on it, like about my own experience with just Saturn stuff in general, which is, by the way, just a life, because where it's placed in my chart is just a lifelong thing for me. It doesn't matter what the transits are; they'll trigger it. But I mean, I'm always doing my Saturn stuff. For me, because it's in like the Cancer in the fourth house, it has to hit me in my body. And I know in your first house that way too. And so sometimes for me, that's why you talked about football injuries, but I have some different health things. I think part of that's because part of the wisdom comes from I have to be like in me that way. I can't not be. And so even with the idea of limits, and I don't mean limits in a limiting way, I just mean like there just are limits within our bodies and within what we can and can't do or how things work. And part of Saturn, I think especially in the first house, is learning about those limits, right? And so injuries is one of the best ways to know your limits, right? I mean, that's like, I know there's other people, I have a friend at his Saturn return, which was just a couple years ago, he broke his back, and so it's common that if we're not in alignment, like physically in some respects, in some ways, we crumble or fall apart a little bit, so that we have to sort of rebuild that alignment or structure. But what else would you say? Because you have got, I mean, for anyone who doesn't already know, Cameron has Mars, Uranus, Neptune, Saturn, Mercury, and Venus all in Capricorn in the first house. What's interesting is that Venus is retrograde, just throwing that out there because that's in there as well. But that's a lot of, so much of your chart is Saturn ruled. So much of it is Saturn ruled. do you feel like at this point, do you feel like they all work together, all those planets, or do they feel, I guess I'm just curious, does it feel like one big unit, or do they feel like they each do their individual things?
I would say Mars and Uranus kind of sometimes feel like they do their own thing because they're so moment to moment is the way I experience them. But the other planets, they feel like they really have become very cohesive. Uh, in the way I do experience things, like when people talk about intuition, sometimes like mine literally goes directly to my organ systems, which is like the structure of my body. And then like I receive messages like Saturn, like when we think of limitations and restrictions, we think of it as Saturn, things that are from our unconscious mind from the outer planets get crystallized into our tissues, which is the fascia of the body, which is a limit for sure.
Yeah.
So it's really, and then also in Kabbalah, Saturn represents what's called Binah, which is really actually just understanding.
Yeah.
So that's the way that I experience all those. They just like help me understand things more. But they do pretty much all feel like they're together, like I said, besides the Mars and the Uranus, which I just don't know. Like I can't know. But I guess that kind of sounds like Neptune there too. Like I don't know. It just comes through when it comes through, and then I'm like, there it is. Yeah. And it always is in interaction with people too, because like a lot of astrologers, they're not like in a store where everybody can come in all day long. And like somebody at a checkout line, like I'm working with people like that. Like people coming in, I work with them, and then they leave. And that's very present in the moment. This person comes in, walks away, now I feel this way. This person comes in and walks away, now I feel that way. So that's how I've been experiencing it now. But it definitely wasn't always cohesive for sure. I don't know if that answered the question. But...
Yeah, no, it does. And then I'm curious about, because for me, Neptune and Saturn are both so tied with reality. So for me, Neptune is like the real sounds so silly, the real reality. But Neptune is like what actually is, right? If Neptune is what is, if all of our filters didn't get in the way. And so we get glimpses of that. We get glimpses of that at different moments. I mean, there's no way, I don't think we could ever, as long as we're in our human form, I don't think we can stop on some level our perspective or perception or, conditioning. It's just part of what we are. But then Saturn also is this planet of reality, almost more so Saturn is the planet of reality that we hit the edge and realize it's not real. And then Neptune is the part that, shows us that was an illusion to begin with, but they both are reality, right? In that way. And you've got them both together. So it's got to be interesting to have this sort of ethereal, spiritual experience of things at the same time, having them fully embodied. So I wondered if you had any thoughts, or even with your Saturn return, is your own reality structure crumbling? Like, is there anything you would want to share about points in times? Like, what is that like? Do you have moments when all of a sudden you just realize, wow, that just wasn't real, and you see it differently?
Yeah. So the way I look at those two as both being reality, one is the reality that we have crystallized and created, and the other one is actual reality, like you were saying. Mm-hmm. And the way that I experienced it directly this year, within the past year, is Neptune being like the lymphatic system, which is like just like consciousness. It's the ocean. So if we're like thinking of Neptune as the all, then we just make ourselves that Neptune, and the all would just be the lymphatic system. And then Saturn is everywhere where we have stagnation or something's crystallized. So the more that we give our body the capacity to have the lymphatic system moving, we actually can just like experience direct consciousness more.
And how do we all do that? Since probably anyone listening is probably now like, how do I just get my Saturn?
I would start with drinking the plant calendula. That's my favorite one to go to.
You have an actual prescription.
Yeah. Yeah, calendula. And then honestly, when you can literally tap on your body, or you go on Google and you look at where all the lymphatic system points are, and you just tap them. You literally just tap them, and then you're allowing energy to move. And when the energy is moving, you can have more space, and it actually changes time, because space and time go together. So I've been moving away from time and like space, because then time doesn't become a limitation or a restriction the way that most perceive it. That's
Cool.
how I experienced the Neptune and
Yeah.
Saturn.
Yeah. No, you brought it right back to the body, which is great.
Yeah.
What would
Which
your
I
advice?
realized, yeah,
Oh.
when I bring it back to the body,
Mhm.
then it's actually just like allowing it to be practical and the consciousness is just coming through. And it's not, it is ethereal, but we're actually just here and we just do that. That's just what we are.
Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
more that we know that, yeah, the more we feel like we're in our own authority.
So what would you say? So for people who are wanting to bring out more of their Saturn, kind of the same way that, Cassia gave some advice, what would you say as far as, and what do you think is a first step? What do you think are some first steps or some of your wisest thoughts about incorporating more of Saturn, being more Saturn?
I always tell people to start with creating space for reflection. Because that is discipline. And it's like the beginning steps of creating a discipline, but you don't have to be so rigid about it. You just create this space. So if you give yourself 20 minutes a day, you could give yourself 20 minutes a day to breathe or to reflect or to actually think about what type of discipline would be best for you to empower yourself.
I think discipline is it. You just hit on that, but as you said it, I was thinking, we talked about discipline a little bit earlier on, but wherever Saturn is in your natal chart, for example, or where it's coming around in transit or progression, it does show where you need to be disciplined. But discipline is not always working harder, right? Like I was saying earlier, like sometimes it is, being disciplined to calm down. I mean, could be as simple as that. But I think you're right about the being discipline. It's a hard thing, right? When you just tell someone, okay, well, you need to go be disciplined. This is why I'm trying to challenge us to okay, so what are some real practical ways to, say if someone comes to us and we realize, okay, you really need to practice more discipline, but how does someone do that? And I agree that reflection and time are part of it, right? Reflection and time, because discipline in itself and knowing where you need to be disciplined, it's pretty hard to figure that out if you're not very connected with what you actually need. And I think that's part of what goes on with most of us in this world is we're not very connected with those parts of us. And that takes time, and Saturn also in some respects, it can be a planet of solitude, even though it's hardworking and whatnot. But there is this idea of solitude, of being with yourself in your own body, with your own being, so that it could speak to you.
Yeah,
is there what else would you suggest, or maybe what are some other highlights that you would say,
alignment. Like you said something about alignment that really stuck out to me, because Sagittarius and Jupiter is about natural law, and this natural law is encompassing all this, and if you don't get into alignment with that, then you're going to feel restricted and things are going to mess up. So getting in alignment with how things just are, accepting things as they are. Also literally getting your body into alignment. I'm always bringing it back to the body. It's if your posture is up and you get your back cracked, you just feel better. You have more space, so time, going back to time again, when you feel that much space, time doesn't even restrict you like it would before. Because we're literally walking around with the issues in our tissues.
Well, and it's easier. I think maybe it was Soul was doing a presentation on something, and she was talking about alignment in Capricorn, but she was talking about how, same as when your spine's in alignment, when you get yourself in alignment, that life just isn't so hard. And so I think that's what you were saying. So part of the Saturn is trying to help us. It's like a chiropractor, right? It's trying to get us into this space, and not just physically, but on all levels, so that we can go with our own flow. I think that is part of it. And I think when life gets hard, and I'm a fan of hard work when it's worthwhile. So this is not me against hard work, but oftentimes when life gets hard, it's because we're not in alignment. And then that's one of the things that Saturn shows us. I mean, to me, it's one of the biggest things Saturn shows us.
Yeah, and I don't look at Saturn as hard work either like that, especially from the Capricorn perspective. When it begins as yin, the first thing is yin, and then it's cardinal. So it's starting inside of us. So it's not really, that's just something that has happened. That's not really what it is. And that's like what Saturn told me, so I become in alignment. So we have to
Mhm.
remember that. It starts inside of us, whatever the Saturn function really is.
Yeah. It's like I think the part that feels like hard work is more the undoing all that we did before. It's not the actual forward motion of
A thousand
Capricorn
percent.
or Saturn. So,
Yeah, 1,000%.
yeah. What else? Would you have anything else you want to offer before we have Susie has so patiently waited her turn?
Uh, I would say like just understanding like when a lot of people have Saturn stuff going on, when they feel really cold, you know, literally just getting up and moving your body is so important with Saturn. It's so important. I just couldn't say it enough because yeah, it can just create like it corresponds to depression a lot of times, and depression could just be stillness.
Yeah.
And if you just get up and move, you know, and ask for Saturn to come through, that sometimes just making that space is so important.
Yeah, that's good. And that's simple. Like we can all do that more.
Right. That's not hard work. That's getting
Mhm.
into alignment through reflection and movement, you know, and something
Yeah.
simple that you do over time that creates longevity. And these are all Saturn things.
Yeah. Awesome. Have anything else?
I'm sure I do, but that's it for now.
Yeah. Until next time. Okay. Well, let's go to Susie. And then if you guys think of anything else, you just pop in afterwards.
All right. Thanks.
Susie. Thank you, Cameron. Hi, Susie. I'll unmute you. Hold on, if I can. Can you are you there?
I think so. Can you hear
Yep,
me?
yep. I can hear you
Yeah.
now.
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, everyone. That was really good to hear you all. Very interesting.
Cameron's so good about the body, you
That
know.
was fantastic.
Well,
It really was. It really was.
did you realize, so you and me and Cassia, we all have Saturn and water signs. So I think
I
it was so
did.
I think it was so
Yeah,
it was so good for
yeah,
us to have the body man
yeah,
here. So
yeah,
we
yeah.
can stay
I
in.
was thinking about what we were saying earlier because there is a lot of similarities, although mine's are the angles are Cancer, Capricorn, and then I have also the rulers.
Oh,
Yeah, so that's why perhaps I resonated with what you were saying about your own.
Oh, well, yeah. Well, you know, well,
theme.
your North Node is
That's it.
right on
Yeah.
my Venus is 0 degrees Cancer.
All right.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yes.
Nice to see you here, Susie.
Thank you, sister.
Mm-hmm.
You know my pain.
Well,
Okay.
yes. But
so
what
do
would you, so yeah, well, I have, I mean, several questions, but I would love for you first just to share because I think hearing just about Saturn and Pisces would be beautiful to hear.
Okay. I just want to qualify that I'm not an astrologer, although I've studied it on my own for probably about 20 years, but I never, it's more like another 11th house, 5th house interest, I think.
Well, I'm happy to call you an astrologer if you've studied it for 20 years.
Call me what you like, thank you. Just don't blame me. Okay, I really like my Saturn. But what I wanted to start with is, as you can see, it's just about to sit on my midheaven, and Pluto is just going to leave it, I think, in January. And for me, it was just really interesting.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah. So I live in London, and kind of one of the characteristic of having 11th house Saturn, I suppose, is the place of not belonging in groups and places like that, and perhaps in the homeland. So London, which has been my home since 1990, has always felt like a home because of diversity, because there are so many people here who are not, they don't really belong, but we all kind of make it. And it really is unity and diversity in action for me. So what happened last week, saddened me a lot with our elections and with Brexit. But what was really interesting is I just looked at I've been kind of tracking Saturn over the angles and through my houses. And I just realized actually this morning that in 1990, so when it was in the same position, what actually happened was that the country that I was born in, which was Yugoslavia, had a war, and Slovenia, which was the part of it that I lived in, also was the first part of it that asked for independence. So it was kind of the same situation that is happening now. So although I was already here, that has happened at home, and a lot of my family members were down in Bosnia, down in south, in the areas where there was a lot of ethnic cleansing going on. So that brings me back to my Pisces and compassion for people with for the underdog of a society. I think that's it's always been me. But the interesting thing is I grew up in a socialist country, and my father was very high up in the army, and he's a strong Capricorn, as is both of my children are very strong Saturn as well. So it's a big thing. But
it's your skip step. We haven't shared, right?
Is it my skip
step? No, it's not.
I didn't think. Yeah,
well,
but it's
that would have been exciting.
Yeah,
it is retrograde though, so we can retrograde is close enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of it is internal learning. So Saturn is in 11th. It rules my midheaven, and also I have a South Node in Capricorn in the 9th house. So the top of my chart is very influenced by Saturn, and even in my youth, I think I spent most of my time reading, so that could have been my son, but it was I think a lot of it was reading classics and philosophy and mystical text from other cultures. So maybe that was the South Node, I think. In terms of the period between Saturn touching my midheaven and then Saturn return, I think that was when I came to England, and I was drawn to Tavistock, which is I've always been drawn to institutions of education, so status that Capricorn and Saturn would bring, and education, that connection was very close, and healing, which was that's psychotherapy and how we give meaning to things. So I spent two years studying there. It was very experiential and really opened my mind to all the things that we repressed. And from then, my big decision was that actually I was then brave enough to start my own family, which previously I was never gonna have children, because that was just gonna be too hard. So I started that journey. And at the same time, I spent the period from Saturn on my midheaven to the IC. I was working in social care with adults with learning difficulties, but learning a lot about children, human development, all the things that can go wrong, all the getting to know different groups that are discriminated and disempowered. And then when Saturn was on IC, then I went back to family therapy. So also very systemic. A lot of my work was very systemic, which is again another Capricorn thing. And what I didn't say about that period, sorry, on the top, and I kind of almost didn't realize how it is important, and I perhaps don't give myself enough recognition. On both sides of it, I was involved with really big societal changes. So kind of my role was in, you've probably heard about Langdon Down, Down syndrome. Yeah. So the person who came up with the diagnosis, he actually worked like less than 5 miles away from where I live. And that's where I started working under kind of the ideology of social role valorization and normalization. So we were changing social structures of how the services are provided to those groups. And it was huge. It was huge in terms of we were moving people who were from birth living in institutions, locked away from everybody's view. We were moving them into family homes, in our normal neighborhoods. So yeah, but for me, it's so normal that I don't think this is anything special, but it is special.
You know what? Hey, I have a question. What you just said made me think of something. I wonder if any of us think that our Saturn stuff is very special. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I think probably not.
I think it's funny because you think about, even though we may have had to work hard, but it probably just feels normal to us.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's what I love about Saturn. It is that circle of grandmothers thinking for generations ahead. It is the timekeepers. It is, let's just do what has to be done. It's really thinking about the collective. But I think it's only when it gets too dry, then it is a problem. But I think a lot of the time, it doesn't have to be. And I think the only times when I did move, I've got a lot of fixed energy as well, and I don't move lightly. But when I did move, was always when I find that it had become too bureaucratic. And but again, I also think that Saturn is quite protective for me, because I think I could easily get lost in too much water. And that I have that structure that actually, says, no, you've got that many people to deal with. You can't just, give everything to that one person. It's actually it's been hugely important. Not easy to accept it, I think, but once I grew into it, and interestingly, then when it was on the IC, then I changed. So by then my children were old enough that they could go to have a bit more independence. But I then started working with children, and I always knew, children were my passion. So I knew that I was preparing for that, but there was just so much to learn. And again, Saturn and 11th house. So I do very much think of myself as a corporate parent. And a lot of my work was working with the most challenging children that we do have through social services. All of my work was in social services, working as a social worker and systemic therapist. So working with children who have asylum seekers, who have experienced significant traumas from abroad, birth traumas, disabilities, children in foster care. Again, initially, that was around changing the way services are provided. So again, that systemic role. I was working in a team for profoundly disabled children, and I specialized for very young children. So I was my role was to support the family and took a whole family view. So when the children have a birth trauma, but also we were then introducing integration of services. So we created teams around the child, because before that, a lot of the services were very disjointed. So you had to go somewhere to see the doctor, somewhere to see the social care, somewhere to see psychologists. So the parents were just constantly having to tell the same story. So we changed that around, and we put the children in the center and the professionals formed a team around them. So that was yeah, good. And I'm still I'm supervising. So as I got older, I'm moving again in that very Capricornian.
Excuse me. We're going to be winding down soon. So Tara, do you have any more questions for Susie?
Yeah, thank you. I was just messaging Linda. I was just going to jump in. Susie, you've given such a good example of just how Saturn has moved through, but I know we have to end, but I don't want to end without you being able to share a few things as far as how you would maybe encourage people to work with Saturn, or things that they could do to bring out more Saturn, just briefly, but maybe even like the top 3 things that you would say.
Yeah, I think it's in the area when we do feel that fear and guilt and kind of not being good enough and whatever, I think the structures that make themselves available there, I think perhaps recognize that they are there for your support and learn to work with them. I think rather than look for them, because I do think they present themselves as limitation. And if you step towards them, it's very good. And the other thing for me in Pisces, it's very much to work with imagination, with spirituality, with dancing, photography, all of those areas, and kind of all is one with chakras, with
So you're speaking, I just want to clarify, you're speaking to the really like the Pisces part of Saturn.
The Pisces now. Yeah. Sorry, I thought that's what you meant now. For the Pisces. I like Saturn. I don't know whether it's because, when you get older, because I realize I see Saturn as the strict teacher at school. He's got you. You may not like them initially, but they know what they're saying, and they have your long-term interest in heart. For me, that's how I experience it. I think it's worth trusting it and not being too scared. And
okay, that's perfect.
Just go there.
Yeah.
Befriend it. Befriend it.
And thank you, everyone. Linda, thank you for being patient. We had some stories roll on, and I was interested in hearing, so I let them go. Thank you for being patient.
Oh no, that's absolutely fine. And do we have any questions from our audience or comments they'd like to make?
Yes, any wise insight anyone would like to offer? I think that's probably a no, Linda.
Okay, Tara, thank you so much for a fantastic meeting on Saturn. Very helpful. Any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to share?
For me, no. I mean, maybe, I could, just like Cameron, we could probably talk on forever. I just wrapping up at the end to say, I think one of the things about Saturn is that there's no one way to do it, which of course, you already took it off, Cher. Anyway, I just want to say this. Saturn is about being your own authority. So no matter what any of us say or what anyone says or whatever we read, the one thing about Saturn is you really just need to find your way. And part of that comes from trying things out and doing things. And I think that is important to remember, right? The idea of being sovereignty is a good Saturn word. It comes from having the guts to do it your way, whatever that way means. And I think I just like to leave it there. Being your own authority means that no one but you can do that. So yeah, that's all I got.
Okay, thank you so much, Tara, and thanks to our volunteers, and we'll catch you all next time.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank